So, as some of you, as regular attendees know, we tend to have a mix of topics among a few different categories: technical topics, which can be accounting issues, things like M&A, the economy, the marketplace for VC, just a number of different things. And we'll intersperse with some of those things on kind of general business conduct, how to do things in a better way. We'll sometimes look at things like strategy, strategic planning. In a couple months, we're going to be having a speaker on the most effective ways for presenting financial information. So today's meeting is kind of a different sort of meeting for us, but we're doing it with a speaker who's now back for the fourth time over the past 10 or 12 years. Every couple of years we'll have Hans back, usually on a different topic. And what he's going to be looking at for us is the concept of how you approach projects, how you approach thinking through issues, thinking through problems, and the fact that that when you do it in the right way, and there's different techniques and tools that you can bring to use to bear to do things in a right way, that you want to get to the point in a project where you realize success is assured from this point forward. We've done a lot of work to get to this point, and we may still have some more work to do, but we can now see that success is going to be assured, which is where the title for the talk came from. So Hans himself has been a consultant for a number of years, and he's also worked inside companies. He's worked in the commercial real estate business, has worked in banking, has been a CIO at companies, and he's done it in both the United States as well as in the Netherlands, and he brings that experience to bear, as well as some extensive travel around the world at client sites. So I don't want to forget a couple of things. One of the things I did want to mention, Hans's college degree is in both economics and philosophy. And for those of you who are familiar at all with philosophy, or people who have studied it, it really can enable you to bring a different kind of thinking to the business world and to business problems. And in talking with Hans, which I've done a number of times over the years, and Hans, I've never commented this to you, but I've noticed that you will often make references to philosophical concepts. And I think it's one of those things that really adds to your own sort of tool shed for what you bring to bear in looking at different issues. So let me turn things over to Hans, and Hans, take it away.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Dan, and thank you all for your time. Let's start with the Zoom things and share my screen. Okay, here we are. Well, when you hear the introduction by Dan, you shouldn't be surprised that what I want to talk about today is about change management. And when you talk about change management, it's about change, and change is not just, you know, the cartridge in the printer is empty and I'm going to change it. You talk about something that is a lot more substantial. So what are causes of change? Well, first of all, you have an external disruption of your organization. And then you might think, what is happening in the environment? And obviously, what is on all our minds today is the pandemic. We hear people talk about, well, what's going to happen to an office space? Do we still need an office space? Do we need more? Do I do less? What's going to happen with working from home, working remotely? Then, of course, there are things, what's going on in politics. People might wonder, well, what's going to happen with the minimum wage? And, you know, there's so many things that happen from the outside and has an immediate effect on your business. So it's a disruption of the business as usual. Apart from external, we also have internal. And when you talk about internal, it is errors and violations. It's a very broad spectrum, but that's the way it is. You can imagine that something goes wrong in your organization. There's friction or conflict. It might be something in maintenance. You know, those things you need to deal with. If it keeps coming back, then it creates change. Well, if change occurs, then you will have to do some problem solving and implementing a solution. That also is a form of change that disrupts business as usual. Think about the problem solving, renovation, innovation of projects, or even introduction of a new strategic direction. Now, when you are focused, or when you are faced with a change project, then as a manager, as an executive, what you would like to know is, well, what is the scope? You know, when you talk to a consultant, they might say, well, this takes X number of dollars and X numbers of time. And how can you verify, right? So let's say you're going to implement a new ERP system, and enterprise resource system. Is that a big project? Is it a small project? Is it expensive or not? Well, there are certain ways that you can find out what the level of disruption is, the duration and the expense, simply by using a model that I have used throughout the years with a lot of success. And here it is. Look at the anagram chaff pilot, and I'll walk through it very briefly. So let's say that you are introducing an ERP system in your business, and how big is that? What is the scope of the project? So you just go by it one by one, and perhaps one of the items is not really applicable, but you know, you need to check. So first, commercial. What is happening in your interaction with your clients? Does it have an effect on it? Well, if you do an ERP system, perhaps you have some more automation, so your interactions will be different. You have to take care of that. Housing. I mean, nowadays with computers, things are different. In the old days, you needed special facilities with climate control. But you can imagine that when you have a system, that you need more security. What is the physical access to the system? Are there any requirements? Banking, oftentimes they have something off-site. They have 3 sites where they have the computers, just to make sure that when something goes wrong, that you're not losing the data or that you lose the functionality. We go to administrative organization. Well, if you're letting more people get access to the software, to the program, then they will need login IDs, and you need to make sure that when people leave the organization, that their access is being revoked. Finance. You can imagine if you're doing a project that it needs to be financed, and how are you going to do that? Is it a lease? Are you going to borrow money for it? There's so many things that you just need to go through it and use your mind. I mean, if you don't know, then you can go to a financial executive and say, well, you're going to introduce this system. What is it going to involve from the finance department? Personnel. Always, people are always involved. They might have to be trained. You know, they need certain skills in order to get online. We all are experiencing that right now with Zoom. We're learning so much. I, for information. When you already have data in your organization and you are migrating it into the new platform, that has to be done, right? So you need to know what information do I need to bring in, and perhaps that information need to be scrubbed. You look for duplications. Perhaps you're looking for a certain way that you want to organize it. Legal. Well, if you're buying something or if you're leasing something, then there are contracts involved. So you need to make sure that is okay. And right now, I'm just thinking out loud, and I hope that you as an executive will do the same thing when you're confronted with a project, and you need to know, you know, if it's big or very much involved and how much disruption it will create in the organization. Well, there you already have organization, which is then the next piece of the puzzle. Organization is both things. It is structuring the organization and also the business itself. So if you are creating an ERP system, what does it do for the organization, or how it is structured? How does it tie different departments together? And lastly, of course, there is the technology and tools. If you are bringing in new software that has to be uploaded, it has to be maintained. Perhaps people at their workspaces need other gadgets in order to access it. So this is a way of looking at the scope of the organization, and we can arrange it a little bit differently. We can do it like this. And the reason I'm sharing this is because whatever you do, whichever design aspect is involved, somehow it always translates back to something finance. Because whether it is people's time, whether it is something that you procure, whether you are hiring outside consultants, there's always a finance aspect to it. But there is a caveat, for the simple reason that all change projects have a finance component. It doesn't mean automatically that you have a financial problem. And a lot of people, they think, oh, it has to do with finance. I have a financial problem, so therefore I need to look for a financial solution. That is not the case. But what I've noticed is that this is not a shared perception or a shared interpretation of change management. So let's have a look, what is the shared approach to change management more in general. And I would like to explain that to you in the form of an experience I had with working with coaching organizations. You know, when you work for a coaching organization and you give a presentation, they always stress to you, we need to have take-home value. That's very important for our members. And then they'll explain to you, well, what we mean by take-home value is that, you know, something tangible. The minute you come back to your desk, you can implement it immediately. It's something that you can do right away. And it shows that participants are really looking for answers. So they have a pressing problem, or perhaps they're very successful and they're looking for ways to be more successful. So there is a recognition that something is going on and it needs their attention, or they just want to become more effective, and who wouldn't want to be that? So when you take a look at the solution side, there is a demand, and when they ask for something they always tell you, we don't want vitamins, you know, so strengthening their immunity. It's always what they call, we need more aspirin. And with aspirin, I mean, we need painkillers, I mean, immediate effect. And so what they're looking for is basically how to treat the symptoms or effects of something. They're looking for the quick fix. And it's always interesting as a change manager, when you talk about the quick fix, it has to be cheap, it has to be fast, and by all means, no involvement of executives. And that is something that is not always quite possible. So if that is the setting that we are experiencing, now let's have a look at the supply side of all those solutions, because by no means there are no shortages of solutions. If you go online, if you go to LinkedIn, if you look in trade journals, it's all about solution. And it kind of reminds me of a radio program in the Netherlands, and it was called U vraagt en wij draaien, or you ask and we play. You know, and that's the way it is. And so what we see, it's always about tools, and it's technology, or nowadays apps for mobile applications, or more skills training. You know, and obviously, you know, you have to do it with a certification, because that kind of ties you to the company, and you can do follow-up. Nowadays, what is very popular are leadership trainings, and it's interesting to mention that leadership, basically, it means improving interpersonal relationships. You know, and by no means do I want to denigrate the importance of it, but if you're really dealing with a systemic problem in the organization, you know, there are other things that you need to do first before you can concern yourself with leadership. Apart from the skills training, there's also specialized knowledge. And what we see is that specialized knowledge is particularly focused on analysis. And then we have spoken before about Colonel John Boyd, well known for the design of the F-16 fighter. He had this wonderful expression, and he said about analysis, we're learning more and more about less and less until we know everything about nothing. Another thing that I hear often is deep domain expertise. There is a great reference for knowing a lot about very little. But the main thing that I see all the time are best practices. And actually, I really became familiar with them when I came to the US. It was the first time that basically I heard about best practices in business. Now, the nice thing about best practices is that it kind of gives you a scientific feel, gives you the idea that, you know, something was really researched. So with all those supplies at your fingertips, what are we going to do? Well, we take a trip to the solution depot. And just like going to Home Depot, you know, you're pushing your cart through the aisles and you see all those wonderful solutions and you're piling them in your cart. And when you come home, you put them on your desk and then you start looking and say, nice. But what am I going to do with it? And you start looking at it and kind of trying to justify your purchase because you're looking at the specs. You know, how wonderful they are, how well they were designed, how fast they are, how much money they are going to save. And it really gives you bragging rights. A lot of people, they procure those things and say, well, it's innovation. You have the latest and greatest. And if you don't really know why you bought it, why you were caught up in going through the aisles, you might always say, well, it was on sale. So the commonality that I see in all those solutions, there's always a promise to raise bottom line results. And not only raising the bottom line results, it's kind of short term. And how do they do it? There are promises to increase operational efficiency. And most of the time that refers to cutting costs. And typically we're looking at employees because they are the largest sum on the P&L. Nowadays, what we see, a lot of employees are being replaced by independent contractors. But I think something that is more egregious is the cutting cost in the value proposition. You know, you can imagine that you are standardizing your offering, whether those are products or services, or you get cheaper resources, or you're going to outsource something to someone else. But the problem that you have with that approach is that you see a convergence happening in value propositions between what you have and what your competitors have. And as a result, the only way that you can compete is basically on price. And when you're competing on price, that means that you have to give discounts. And that's kind of how you lose your money, and you're losing your customers. Because we all know there are things that we have in our lives that suppliers in you are their obvious choice. I remember, whenever I needed a dinner jacket, there was always a brand. When I was trying something on, I said, "Oh, this really feels good, looks good," and I looked at the brand and said, "Oh, no wonder," right? And so those are things that are very important that you're not going to change too much in your value proposition, because it has an effect on the expectations of your customers. So the outcome of a very solution-oriented approach to change management is that you still have your problems, because somehow they persist, they recur, they keep coming back. And oftentimes what you hear people say is that I have to put out fires all the time, right? It is really like playing a game of whack-a-mole. One problem comes up and you solve it and another pops up. And it might even be related, but it feels like there is a new symptom or it's a new effect. And what I'm surprised about is that if you have symptoms, if you have experience certain effects, well, then you have to think that there must be a root cause. Those things don't happen automatically. And so you have to be aware of the cause and effect relationship. And I'm really flabbergasted to see how little demand there is for root cause analysis, right? And I mean, just go online and look at the major consulting corporations that work internationally. You see if they do root cause analysis. No, it's all solution, applications, technology, but no root cause analysis. But this is something that you have to remember, and we can take it from the medical world. They have this wonderful expression that says, prescription without diagnosis is malpractice. And so the diagnosis is the root cause analysis, right? I mean, can you imagine if you go to the doctor, you just open the door and say, here's your prescription. I mean, you ask, well, aren't you going to talk to me? Aren't you going to do some tests? No, here's the prescription. It really is amazing. And so what it does, it makes you stop and think. And this is what Einstein said. He said the perfection of means and the confusion of ends seems to characterize our age. There is so much emphasis on solutions, on means, right? And we are completely confused. We kind of lose track why we are in business. What is the purpose of the business?
You know, Hans, if I can make an observation, I remember hearing a phrase, oh gosh, probably 30 years ago, that encapsulates some of what you're saying, which is when you're preparing to implement an ERP system, if all you do is take your existing processes and automate them, what you're going to end up doing is taking any of your existing problems and just make them happen faster.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what you really need to do is use the system implementation as the opportunity to find the root causes of problems in your processes, and then as part of the implementation, get those, figure out the solutions and get those solutions automated then.
Yeah, I agree. And what I've seen in introduction of ERP systems, that if you don't really know what the purpose is of an ERP system, I did one implementation, and basically they had decided to use an ERP system basically to replace a couple of excess databases, right? And I said, well, isn't it kind of an expensive way to go about it? So I changed things around. But you really need to be aware of the purpose, and like you say, if you are just automating something, then you're making your same mistakes, but you do it more efficiently, and nobody really benefits from it.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, perfection of means and the confusion of ends. What we see happening in the world is that the perfection of means always translates into how to make more money. And going back to the Chef Pilot model that I shared with you just a minute ago, you know, the thinking is that, oh, we have a financial problem and therefore we need a financial solution. And so what the solutions are offering is always a way to raise bottom line results. Now, again, it makes you stop and think. So what is the argument? How do people, you know, come to that conclusion? Well, in order to figure that out, and here's something of philosophy and logic in particular, we're going to look at the syllogism, right? So I take a theory, or I take a thesis, or a premise, the major premise. Then I look at the experience that I find, the minor premise, and then from those I come up with a conclusion. Now, this is what is happening in best practices. You know, they say, if this is valid, if my theory is valid for some, then it is valid for all. So what people are doing, they create a questionnaire and they contact, say, 15 or 30 executives, and they ask them all the same questions. And based on their answers and based on those questions, they kind of create a theory. And this is their line of reasoning. If it is valid for some, it must be valid for all. And guess what? It is valid for some, because that is their whole research. And so their conclusion is therefore it is valid for all. But here is the pitfall. This is what we call a fallacy, right? It's the affirming of the consequent. The right way is saying if it is valid for all, then it must be valid for some, right? So we always, when you look at best practices, this is something that is underlying, right? Because their theories might be, or the research that they did might be in a different industry, in a different country, in a different era, in a different industry, right? So there are so many variables. So definitely be aware when you're looking at best practices. Basically, what they're doing is they try to extract a theory for management from a theory about management. And that is kind of a weird step to do. And so what they do, they create prescriptions. They can create prescriptions for increasing your operational efficiency, or to do a merger and acquisition in order to add a bottom line of an acquiring of an acquisition to their own company bottom line. Or you might do a stock buyback program for the simple reasons that, well, we have the money and we believe that it is the best way to invest our money. That's kind of an interesting thing, and we'll come back to this. So what does this mean, this way of looking for solutions rather than first doing a root cause analysis? What does it tell you about the thinking of people? Well, clearly, they have a very mechanistic perception of an organization. They treat the organization like a machine or like a tool, like it's an instrument of the owner. And we can see that the objective is always to do something more efficiently, the ease of use, or just getting the job done. And there are no more questions asked. So when you look at an organization as if it is a machine, that means that you don't recognize that the machine has a purpose of itself, of its own. Instead, it has a function or an application for the owners. And that is to maximize the monetary value it generates for the shareholders. And so the purpose is then determined by the owners, how they use it, how they abuse it. I mean, let's take a look at the tool that you have in your own toolbox back in the garage, right? Take a screwdriver. Well, what is the purpose of a screwdriver? Well, it's the purpose that you give it. Either you're very careful and you make sure that you keep the tip nice and clean, or you use it for opening a paint can, right? Or you might use it as a crowbar. The screwdriver is not going to complain. Another thing that we see in looking at an organization, that if it is a machine, is that executives are agents. We've all heard about the agency theory. And that means that agents, they act on behalf of the shareholders. Another way of saying that is that agents, they have a fiduciary responsibility, both legally and ethically. They are bound to do what is in the best interest of shareholders. Now, what does that mean? When you're facing problems in an organization that keep coming back? Well, in my experience, they show very little interest in the current state of the business. What is the business doing right now, and what is it capable of doing? Another thing that we notice is that there is no money available for developing the capability and the capacity of the machine to function, right, and to realize the purpose. But if you say that the organization has no purpose of its own, it only has a purpose for the shareholders, then it's understandable that people are not going to invest, because that's what it is. If you're going to develop the capability and capacity of the system, that means, for example, process engineering, continuous process improvement, and quality, expense. And if you pay it for the organization, it's not going to go to the shareholders. However, the real pain, the reason why they're looking for painkillers, is not efficiency. It is effectiveness. We already spoke about that before, because effectiveness is something that is immediately recognized by your buyers or by the users of your products and services. And you know what? Your buyers and users, they are the source for the money that you so desire. And what we see is that they create more efficiency, but they do it at the expense of effectiveness. Now, Dan already mentioned that I wrote a book, Get to the Root, and I'm very happy to say that it will be published by McGraw-Hill by the end of the year. And in that, I use an analogy for this, increasing your efficiency, but doing it at the expense of the effectiveness. And I call it the Black Knight syndrome. And that is after, this. Monty Python's famous movie, The Holy Grail, where King Arthur, here on the left, is met by the Black Knight, and the Black Knight said, "None shall pass." And so there is this fight, and Arthur, a good swordsman, and he just slashes off one arm of the Black Knight, and he said, "Oh, it's just a scratch." And they keep on fighting, and he slashes off his other arm, and then the comment is, "Now will you let me pass?" No, this is just a flesh wound. And that's something that I see so often. We're so concerned with increasing the efficiency, but we're doing it at the expense of effectiveness. If you're not pleasing your customers, then they will start looking for other opportunities. And one of the things that you will notice, they start talking about price. I mean, all of a sudden, price becomes an issue, and you have to see if perhaps there is another opportunity for them elsewhere. So the real pain that they are experiencing is something that is enterprise-wide. Just take a look at that pilot model. You can see all those aspects, all those organs in the organization, they are interconnected. And so when you are experiencing those problems, those systemic problems, you know that it is inherent to the system itself. It's inherent to the way it was designed, the structure or the organization of the system, its operation or implementation, the maintenance and management. Now, I hope that you notice when I talk about these tasks are typically management tasks, for the simple reason that it requires a certain amount of authority to make changes, make such dramatic changes to the organization. And therefore, it has to do with the responsibility to make those changes and to address the systemic problems in the organization. So that said, we go back to stop and think. Think what this means, and how you can react to it. We go back to Albert Einstein, who had the famous quote, "The significant problems we face cannot be solved at the level of thinking with which we created them." We've all heard it over and over again. People are using it at nauseum, and they're all not as a, yeah, I know, that's the definition of insanity. But what I don't realize is that Einstein is giving them a solution. Is that the way out is that you have to change your level of thinking. Because you can only do something differently or do something else if you start thinking differently. The reason that you do the same thing and get the same outcomes is because of your level of thinking. So what could be a new level of thinking? Well, what happens if you are changing the perception of a business? Let's say that instead of looking at a business as a machine, you look at it as an organism. And that means that when you have an organism, it has a reason of its own. It has a purpose of its own. In good English, we call it a raison d'être. And so its principal purpose is its own survival. It's the same thing that happens to human beings. We want to keep on going. We're holding on to life. And the only way to do that is, take your vitamins, increase your immunity, especially in the days that we're living right now with COVID. And for an organization, that means that you have to develop the capability and capacity of the organization to realize its purpose. And especially, you need to look at their ability to adjust and adapt to the disruptive effect of new and unforeseen circumstances. So what we see when we take a look at a business as a system, as an organism, that the parts are organs. And the organs don't have a purpose of their own, but they have a function. And what you see that just like in the body, you have all those organs, and if you take just one organ out, it'll die, it will wither. But inside the organization, that has functions. The heart is pumping the blood, putting it through the whole body. The lungs make sure that you get oxygen in the blood and feed everything. And in an organization, it's the same thing. You cannot just take the finance department and take it out and then what, right? It's all interconnected, and so they support the purpose of the organization as a whole. Now, I hope that you note when you're talking about an organization as an organism, that the language is becoming kind of biological, because all of a sudden the head of the CEO or the senior manager, we call them the head. When you talk about the firm or the company, all of a sudden we talk about the corporation, after the Latin corpus for body. So let's have a look now how this organization as a corpus, as a body, how can it be assured of success? And in order to do that, I'll use the analogy of the Wright brothers. I really enjoy the Wright brothers, their work, because it is their level of thinking. I mean, just imagine, this is the end of the 1900s. In 1900, Wilbur Wright became interested in aviation. And so what did you do? He knew about a man by the name of Octave Chanute. He was an aviation pioneer, but also he was a railroad engineer, and he was well known for the bridges that he built. And so he wrote a letter to him, and he said, for some time now, I've been afflicted with the belief that flight is possible to man. So can you give me the information? And so he sent him the information. And so they had all the lift tables available. And so now, they had to start from scratch. Well, realize in those days, there was no concept of an aircraft. Right now, when you say to a child an aircraft, they will draw you one. But in those days, they had no idea what that would look like. Now, another person that the Wright brothers really enjoyed and were impressed by was the German Otto Lilienthal. But they didn't really want to go his road, because what Lilienthal did is he built a set of wings, strapped them to his body, and he would jump from a hill or from a tower and made a nice glide flight. But in the process, he broke many bones, and eventually he lost his life. So the Wright brothers said, that's not how we are going to do it. So thinking about aircraft, I said, well, if I look at that concept, I can see 3 component parts, right? I can see lift, I can see control, and I can see propulsion. So this is what they did. Because they didn't want to go the route that Lilienthal did, they were not going to work on full scale, but they were going to work on a small scale. And so they created a kite. What's kind of interesting when you take a look at the design, I hope that you can recognize some railroad bridges in it, because this was after Octave Chanute. It's a lightweight construction. It is sturdy. It is flexible, so it can take a hit. You can see that gets the rigidity from all the cross wires. Anyway,
Hey,
so
Hans, a question. You
yes.
mentioned the guy Lilienthal as one of the original early developers, or trying to develop ways of flying. Was he literally using some kind of semi-scientific approach to to find a way to have humans flapping wings and flying that way?
No, no, they didn't. I think mainly what they did, they studied birds, and that was the kind of thing. Aviation was kind of imitating birds rather than more of a scientific endeavor. That is something where the Wright brothers were completely different. I mean, it's fascinating. They basically created the science of aeronautics, because the way they went about it, what you can see here in this model, here you can see tethers, right? And so, well, first of all, when they started out their experiments, they wanted to know a place where there was enough wind and where there was a constant wind, because they only had limited time. So they wrote to the Met Office and said, well, where can we be assured of a lot of wind? And they said, well, go to Kitty Hawk in North Carolina. So that's why they ended up there. And then to see their scientific approach, they made this kite, a scale model. They had tethers, and at the end of the tethers, they had spring balances. And so together with the vanometer, they could measure the wind speed going over the wings, and they could measure the lift that they were generating, and they could do all the triangulations based on these pictures. They took many pictures. It's really interesting to see, and so fascinating. They were nowhere experts. We had lift tables from people that have been pioneering in this field for so long, but basically they couldn't corroborate the information, and so they discarded everything. And after the first year, they went back home and they created a wind tunnel. And in the wind tunnel, they made little, with saw blades, they created little profiles, and they were measuring the lift that was generated. And actually, they wrote the lift formula that we are still using today. So once they had figured out lift, then the next thing was figuring out control. Now, what is interesting is that most people in those days, they said, control is way too difficult. And first we go for straight and level flight. And once we figure that out, then we just add it in, right? Just like you attach a rudder to your dinghy. But the Wright brothers, they were familiar with unstable vehicles, because after all, they were bicycle mechanics. And they realized that control of the aircraft is a matter of interaction between the pilot. You can see one of them here, the pilot and the aircraft. So it's okay that it is unstable. In those days, people were thinking of sailboats, and they were hoping to make their aircraft very stable. And they were banking on the what do you call it in sailboats? They have their self-righting properties. There is a wave, and you're heeling. You go on the side of the wave. You reach on the top, and you go on the other one. But the vehicle is righting itself. They were familiar with, and it's the interaction, right? It's something that I find in organizations. It's the same thing. You need to realize that the success of the organization is in people interacting with the system. It's not either the system. And the more you automate things in business, the more dependent you become on the people for operating the machines, writing the code, and maintaining it. Anyway, so lift, control. The next thing was propulsion, and because of their scientific approach, they just knew the maximum weight of the engine and the propellers. They built their own four-cylinder engine, and the next challenge was propellers. So where do you find information on propellers? Well, they went to a shipyard and said, well, what can you tell me about propellers? And basically they said, well, we just do something, because ships, efficiency is not really an important point. Wright brothers went back home, started thinking, and they realized, well, what is a propeller? And they realized the propeller is basically a rotating wing. And if it is a rotating wing, that means that the lift formula is still applicable. And so they built their propellers. The next year, when they came back to Kitty Hawk, they installed the engine and they installed the propellers. And on December 15th, there was way too much wind, so they couldn't take off. And what they did is they attached tethers to the aircraft to keep it on the ground, and again with spring balances, and they just revved the engine. And the thrust that the engine and propeller was delivering exceeded their expectations. And consequently, that night they sent a telegram to their father and sister back in Dayton, Ohio, and it read, "Success assured." They hadn't flown, but they were just certain that they would take off. It had enough thrust to carry the aircraft in the air together with one of the pilots. And there we have the wonderful picture. The first time that we have heavier than air, controlled, manned, and sustained flight. So one of the things that we can see about an aircraft as an organism, how strange it even may sound, that it has its own purpose, and its purpose is really to fly. You know, an aircraft, when you park it, just like what you would like to do with a boat, you point it into the wind. But if there is enough wind, it will take off. It is going to fly. That's what it wants to do. And that's why, especially with light aircraft, you need to tie it down.
Hey, Hans, a question. Had anyone before the Wright brothers used the concept of propellers in attempting to create a flying machine?
Oh yeah, they were all using propellers. But it was
they didn't
more
know
like,
how to calculate the thrust? Is that the issue?
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, the Wright brothers created the lift formula, right? So they knew the design of the wings, where they would get the most lift. Anyway, it is fascinating, and I don't want to go off on a tangent. But if you take a look at the sail of a sailboat, basically it's the same thing as a wing, and the more camber you give it, so the more it bulges, right? It gives you more power. That's kind of the difference between old cargo ships and right now those trimarans that we see, or even the hydrofoils. You know, those sails are pretty straight, so they're built more for speed than for power. Yeah, it's a good question. You know, the fascination is really with the Wright brothers, how scientific they were in their approach. They were homeschooled, so they learned about chemistry, about mathematics and physics, and they took all that information, all that knowledge, and they applied it. I think that is the lesson that we need to take from it. Oh. So with this, the question then becomes, you know, what determines success? You know, we're talking about when Einstein said the perfection of means and the confusion of ends, right? So what is the end? What is the purpose that you assign to your organization? Well, what we saw is that it very much depends on your perception of the business. Do you see it as a machine where the purpose is making money, or it doesn't have a purpose of its own, but you use it for making money for the owners, fiduciary responsibility? Or do you see it as an organism that it has a reason of its own, raison d'être? You know, make sure that it can do whatever it is designed to do. Another aspect for what determines success is that you have an alignment between the current state of the business and the desired state. Because when that is aligned, then you can take a look at what is the outcome of the organization. What is the result, or what is the profit that you get? And then you are looking at cause and effect. Was it Jim? Did you have a question? Were you raising your?
No.
Oh, okay. I thought you raised.
Oh, I was, but it was for another reason.
Okay. So alignment of the organization, the current state of the organization has to be in alignment with what you wanted to do. And that is determined by the relationship between cause and effect. Right. So what you would like to see is that the parts of the organization, that they function in order to support the purpose of the organization. Now, when you take a look at each and every part, it has to be necessary to be part of the organization. If it doesn't have a function, then there is no reason for that to be inside the system. Not only does it need to be necessary, it also needs to be sufficient to do the job, to support the organization in reaching the outcomes that you are looking for. But apart from being necessary and sufficient, we also need to look at the environment. And this is something that oftentimes is overlooked. An organization is successful also because, for example, there needs to be infrastructure. Right? I mean, you need to get your raw materials. So are there roads to get raw materials to your factory, and are there roads in order to get it away to your clients? If you have employees, you need to think of, are they educated? Are they skilled enough? So there must be an educational system. You need to have buyers and users. There must be a demand for your product. Obviously, it helps if you have a good economy where people have the money and the purchasing power in order to do business with you. How about power and fuel? You know, I don't think we have anybody in Texas, but they know how important it is that you have a proper power grid to work. Now, what I see as a challenge for change managers in this world, and especially when people are looking at a business as a machine, is that there is no interest in understanding the current state, what the system is capable of doing and what it is doing right now. On top of that, there is a vagueness about, you know, what is the purpose of the organization? What is the desired state? Now, when I take a look at the current state and the desired state, when there is a discrepancy between them, that is what we call a problem. That is the definition of a problem. And so it is important that you investigate what your current situation is and that you have clarity about the desired state of the organization. If you don't have that, then obviously there is a lot of confusion. And IBM did a wonderful report in which they interviewed managers from all over the world. And they asked them, well, what is your biggest complaint? What is your biggest fear? And he said that they were completely perplexed by complexity and events. And funny enough, when they all got together, they were asked, well, what is the solution to being perplexed by complexity? And their answer was creativity. And that kind of made me stop and think. I said, what do you mean? So you don't understand how the system works and you want to be creative in order to solve that. So that is kind of trial and error, right? So, but basically what is happening is what you see, there is a lack of understanding how an organization works as a singular, unique, integrated, and open system. And so if you have a lack of understanding, then the solution is to get understanding, right? That is something that you need to learn. Well, there are ways to do that. And now I'm using something again from John Boyd. He said, well, the first thing is that you take the whole and you break it up in its component parts. That's kind of what Newton said too, right? That is the idea of analysis. Now, what happens if you take a whole and you break it up into its component parts? It's that you have a whole collection of parts and you can see how every part is different and has a different function. So you're unstructuring the system, you kind of destruct it, and it creates a lot of uncertainty and disorder, right? If I take a car and I break it up in its component parts, I no longer have a car, right? I have a whole collection of parts. So this is one way, this is the dominant way that we start looking at organizations. And interestingly enough, what you can see here at the bottom, uncertainty and disorder. And that is something that we recognize that is happening in organizations, right? They have this lack of understanding. They don't know what's going on, and they don't know how to resolve it. You know, the interesting thing when you have a systemic problem is that most of the time people think, you know, there is no solution to it, right? Because it keeps coming back. Well, there is another way of thinking, and that is this one, where you take constructive induction. So now I take all my component parts and I stick them together, and I look at the function that they perform for each other, you know, their interaction, their interdependency, their relationships. And that way of thinking is called synthesis. So what I'm doing here is I take my parts and now I'm integrating them in order to create the whole system. So now I really understand what each part is doing and how they all work together to perform the function of the system as a whole. And so here you see the restructuring. It gets meaning, and once something has meaning, you really get an understanding. Now, what we can see about this, Boyd called this opposing ID change, where you see here you go from the general to the specific, and there you go from the specific to the general. Now, how did Boyd use that? Well, Boyd was a fighter pilot, and you can imagine once you're in the fight that all of a sudden things are happening left and right, and they happen very fast, and you have to make sense out of your environment. Now, the minute that you are confused, that is when you stop, right? You're not reacting, and that's when you become very vulnerable. So what Boyd said, the way to train your mind is that you take a whole bunch of organic wholes, you break them up into parts, and then you take different parts and you put them together. So you create a mental image, right? And you put the mental image that you created on what you see in the outside world. And if that matches, you know what's going on. Alternatively, especially when you talk about dogfights, you might see that there is a mismatch. You said, oh, this is what my opponent is thinking, but this is what is going on in real time. And that's how you can get what he called get inside their decision circle. That's how you can, you have an opportunity. You're reacting a lot faster. It's not really that you make the decision consciously, but you kind of make it intuitive. Anyway, it's a great thing to know about and to read more about. But the idea, what I want you to take away from it, is that analysis, it reveals the structure, how it works. It creates know-how, or what we are known as knowledge. Whereas synthesis, it yields understanding. It explains the role and the function, why something works the way it works within the larger whole. And that means that knowledge and understanding is not the same. And right now in our education, there is such an emphasis on analysis, and people get an enormous amount of knowledge, but it doesn't mean that they have the understanding how it works. And that is borne out by a study like IBM. Now, how can we use this in the business world? And I'll give you an example. Back in the Netherlands, I had an assignment where a financial department said, you know what, the P&L is always late, it's inaccurate and incomplete. And yes, we have a gigantic problem. And oh, by the way, nobody made any mistakes, right? Everyone is just doing their job. So fine, how do I go about it? Well, the first thing that I did, and I apologize, this is still in Dutch, but it doesn't take away from the message. What I knew is that I started with an old profit and loss statement, and I would end with a new profit and loss statement. And in between, that's where everything happened. But the first thing I needed to know is, well, who is involved? Who are the actors, right? And it's something that I could do. And I found out that there were something like 12 or 13 different actors. And I found out that nobody really knew that so many actors were involved, because some of them, they had interactions, but they didn't know about everyone else. So the first thing that you do, just like the Wright brothers, you take your whole and you break it up in your component parts, right? Lift, control, and propulsion. I was looking at the first thing at what are my actors. Once I knew who the actors were, I was able to map out the process. What is it, the things that they're doing? What is their behavior? How are they interacting, right? And this is where you get this whole flow diagram. Now, the nice thing about creating a flow diagram is that once you have the diagram, you can manipulate it, and you can create a different form. Here's another form. Now, the person I was working for was the director of finance, and this was his domain, right? This was his domain. These were domains of different people, right? But you can see this, and this is actually the IT where the P&L was created on the mainframe. Here something is feeding into it, not his domain. These people were feeding into it. And so I wanted the bigger involvement of him in the project. And the first thing that he said to me is, well, Hans, look at my calendar. I have no time. When I showed him this, all of a sudden he realized how important it was for him to take the lead, because whatever was happening in all those other departments, it was messing up his work. So I hope that it gives you an idea when you start thinking differently about the problems, about the changes that are happening in the organization. So on the one hand, is that a system works, then change happens and it doesn't work, and then you have to find a solution in order to make it work again. What I would like you to take away from the presentation is that this approach is very much like psychotherapy, because when you go to the psychotherapy, what is happening is that they ask you questions. And you know what? All the answers are already inside you. You already know the answers. The only thing is that you don't know to ask the right questions. And that is where people like myself, where we can really help. So I hope that it is clear that the way you look at an organization makes all the difference. And in closing, I can explain that to you. I can explain the what and the how, but I cannot understand it for you, right? You really need to do the work yourself. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hans. I think we're at Jim, are you still on or are you off?
Yeah, I'm still on.
Okay, so we can stop the recording now.
Okay.
Hans, thanks a lot. There was a lot to digest there.